The alien warships descended over Detroit on a Tuesday morning, and their massive forms blocked out the sun completely. Commander Vex of the Krell Empire stood on the bridge of his flagship and surveyed the primitive world below with cold satisfaction. Humanity had been marked for conquest, and their planet was rich in resources the Krell desperately needed for their expanding empire. Within hours, the invasion began and energy weapons tore through military installations. While ground forces swept through major cities with brutal efficiency, the Krell were efficient and brutal, and utterly convinced of their superiority over these primitive humans. They had conquered 47 species across the galaxy, and humans would be the 48th addition to their empire. In the chaos that followed, a 7-year-old boy named Marcus Williams found himself separated from his mother during the initial attack. The streets of Detroit had transformed into a war zone with buildings crumbling under alien fire, while people scattered in every direction trying to find safety. Marcus pressed himself against a brick wall, and his small body trembled as Krell soldiers marched past in their dark armor and advanced weapons. That was when he saw the dog standing alone in the street and looking lost. Officer Jake Bennett's partner was a German shepherd named Duke, and he had been separated from his handler during the initial attack on the police station. The building had taken a direct hit, and Duke had fled into the streets on pure instinct. Now the dog stood at the entrance to an alley and whimpered softly while searching for his partner among the chaos and destruction. Marcus recognized the police, fessed on the dog immediately because his Uncle Paul was a cop and had taught him about K9 units. He knew these animals were trained and disciplined and special in ways that regular pets were not. As another explosion rocked the street nearby, Marcus made eye contact with Duke, and the boy pressed a finger to his lips in a silent gesture. Then he slowly raised his hand in a specific motion that he had seen his uncle use countless times during training sessions. Duke's ears perked up with recognition, and the dog understood the hand signal perfectly. "Stay quiet and stay low and wait for the next command." The Krell patrol passed within meters of both boy and dog, but their attention was focused on scanning for adult humans and military threats. They had standing orders to ignore children and animals during the initial sweep because children could be processed later and animals were completely irrelevant to their conquest. But they missed something crucial in their arrogance and assumption of superiority. They missed the moment when Marcus and Duke locked eyes again, and when the boy gestured toward a storm drain with careful precision. They missed when the dog responded with perfect obedience to commands given without a single word spoken aloud. They missed the beginning of something that would grow into Earth's resistance against their occupation. Marcus and Duke stayed hidden in that storm, drained for 6 hours while Krell soldiers secured the street above. The boy kept one hand on the dog's collar, and Duke remained perfectly still and silent, because that was what the hand signals had commanded. When darkness finally fell, Marcus made another signal, and Duke followed him deeper into the underground drainage system. The boy had always been quiet and thoughtful, and the kind of child who watched and learned rather than speaking up. His mother had worried about his silence sometimes, but his teachers said he was just observant and processing the world in his own way. Now those traits were keeping him alive in a world that had gone completely insane. Marcus led Duke through the drainage tunnels using his memory of the city above. He had explored these tunnels once with his Uncle Paul during a ride-along day, and he remembered the basic layout. They found water dripping from a pipe, and Marcus cupped his hands to drink, while Duke lapped at a puddle. They found a dry section where they could rest, and Marcus curled up against Duke's warm body and cried silently for his mother. But when morning came, Marcus dried his tears and started thinking about survival. He knew the Krell would be everywhere above ground now, and he knew he couldn't hide in the tunnels forever. He needed food and better shelter, and maybe he could find other people who were still alive and fighting back. Duke watched the boy with intelligent eyes and seemed to understand that they were partners now. The dog had lost his handler, but here was a small human who knew the signals and gave clear commands and needed protection. Duke's training was to serve and protect, and so that was what he would do. Over the next 3 days, Marcus learned the new rules of his broken world. He learned that Krell patrols moved in predictable patterns and they scanned at eye level, but rarely looked down at the ground. He learned that their sensors detected electronic signals and body heat, but seemed to ignore animals completely. He learned that they thought humans were primitive and stupid, and not worth careful attention. Marcus used Duke to scout ahead whenever they moved to a new location. The dog would go first, and his body language would tell Marcus if danger was near. Ears forward meant alert but not immediate threat. Tail low and body tense meant enemies very close. A specific whine meant the area was clear and safe to proceed. They found food in abandoned homes and stores that the Krell had already searched and dismissed. They found clean water in places humans had overlooked in their panic. And slowly Marcus began to map the city in his mind with safe routes and dangerous zones and places where supplies could be found. On the fourth day, Marcus saw other survivors for the first time. He was hiding in a collapsed building when he heard voices speaking English in whispers. Duke alerted to their presence, and Marcus made the signal for friendly approach. 3 adults emerged from the shadows with makeshift weapons, raised and suspicious expressions on their tired faces. But when they saw a small boy with a police dog obeying hand signals, their suspicion turned to surprise. One of them was a woman with short dark hair and military bearing, and she lowered her weapon slowly. Her name was Lisa Martinez, and she was a former Army combat engineer. Her unit had been destroyed in the first wave, but she had managed to escape with 3 other soldiers. They had gone underground and were trying to survive while looking for other humans who might be organizing resistance. Marcus didn't say much because talking wasn't his strength, but he showed them what he and Duke could do together. He demonstrated the hand signals and Duke's responses and how they had been moving through Krell-controlled territory without being detected. He showed them his mental map of patrol patterns and safe routes. Lisa knelt down to Marcus's level and looked into his eyes with respect rather than pity. She asked him if he wanted to join their group and help them survive and maybe fight back. Marcus nodded once, and that simple gesture marked the beginning of something the Krell would never see coming until it was too late. Lisa's group had established a small base in the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city, where Krell sensors couldn't penetrate the thick concrete and metal infrastructure. 3 other soldiers had survived with her, and their names were Kevin Price and Amy Chen and Danny Rogers. They were trained fighters, but they were struggling with the new reality of fighting an enemy with superior technology and overwhelming force. When Marcus arrived with Duke, the dynamic shifted immediately because the boy brought something they desperately needed, which was intelligence about enemy movements. Over the following days, Marcus proved invaluable to the group because his small size allowed him to scout areas too dangerous for adults to approach. Duke's training meant they had an early warning system that the Krell couldn't detect or intercept. Marcus spent hours watching Krell patrols from hidden positions, and he noticed patterns that the adults had missed. The aliens moved with mechanical precision, but they never varied their routes once established. They scanned at their own eye level, which was much higher than human average, and they completely ignored anything below knee height. They used drones for aerial surveillance, but the drones were programmed to ignore Earth animals as non-threats. One evening, Marcus was drawing in the dirt with a stick and trying to explain what he had observed to the soldiers. His voice was quiet but certain when he spoke about the patterns he had seen. The Krell don't look down much because they're tall and they scan straight ahead at their own height. And they think we're stupid and primitive and not worth careful attention. Lisa watched the boy draw patrol routes in the dirt, and something clicked in her tactical mind. She asked Marcus how many hand signals Duke knew and understood and could respond to reliably. Maybe 30 signals or so, because Uncle Paul was teaching me more before the invasion happened. Duke knows all the basic commands plus some special ones for police work. Kevin leaned forward with sudden interest and pointed out that 30 commands meant 30 different messages could be sent silently. The Krell monitored all radio frequencies and had hacked human communication networks, but they weren't watching for hand signals between humans and animals. They weren't paying attention to dogs at all. Amy added that if they had more dogs and more handlers, they could coordinate movements across the entire city without any electronic communication. It would be a network the aliens literally couldn't see or intercept. Danny asked the obvious question about where they would find more trained dogs in a city under alien occupation. Marcus spoke up again with that quiet certainty that made adults stop and listen despite his age. The animal shelter 3 blocks from the police station has rescue dogs that were being trained before the invasion. And there's a fire station on Maple Street that keeps search and rescue dogs for emergency response, and Lisa made a decision right then that Marcus was too valuable to risk on scouting missions anymore, but the boy would have argued if she had said it out loud. Instead, she asked him to teach Kevin and Danny the hand signals so they could start working with Duke while Marcus helped plan their next moves. Over the next 2 weeks, Lisa's team carefully extracted dogs from locations Marcus had identified. They found 23 trained animals in various facilities, and homes, and each dog was confused and traumatized by the loss of their human partners, but their training remained solid and reliable. Marcus became the bridge between the traumatized dogs and the uncertain humans. While the adults worked to establish supply lines and safe houses, the boy spent hours with each dog and learned their personalities and their specific training and their individual strengths and weaknesses. Duke remained his constant companion, but Marcus developed working relationships with the entire pack they were building. There was Bella, who was a Belgian Malinois trained for narcotics detection, and she could smell Krell troops from 100 meters away because their alien biochemistry was distinctly different from anything on Earth. There was Ace, who was a bloodhound with tracking abilities that helped the Resistance locate other survivors hiding in the ruins. And there was Shadow, who was a black Labrador trained in search and rescue, and who seemed to understand human emotional distress with uncanny accuracy. A former police canine trainer named Greg Palmer joined the Resistance after Marcus and Duke found him hiding in an abandoned veterinary clinic. Greg watched Marcus work with the dogs and was amazed at the natural rapport the boy had developed in such a short time. Most handlers train for months to build that kind of trust and communication, but this kid just understands them on some instinctive level. Lisa pointed out that Marcus wasn't training the dogs in the traditional sense, but rather communicating with them as equals and partners. There was a fundamental difference in the approach that made it more effective. As the pack grew, so did the resistance network throughout the city. The dogs allowed human survivors to move through dangerous territory without electronic communication, and this meant the Krell couldn't intercept their messages or track their movements. When Krell patrols approached, the dogs sensed them first through smell and sound, and gave humans precious seconds to hide or retreat. But Marcus saw potential beyond just communication and warning systems. One evening, while the Resistance leaders were planning their next supply run, Marcus approached Lisa with Duke and Shadow following close behind. The boy had been watching and thinking and processing everything he had seen about the Krell occupation for weeks now. The Krell use small flying drones that scan for body heat and radio signals during their patrols, but they don't scan for dogs because their system filters animals as non-threats. Automatically, Lisa confirmed this because they had noticed the pattern themselves during observation of enemy movements. Marcus gestured to Shadow, who moved closer on command, and the boy explained his idea. Shadow carries rescue packs with medical supplies and food because she's trained for search and rescue operations. She can go places we can't because the drones ignore her and the Krell soldiers ignore her. Greg understood immediately what Marcus was suggesting, and he nodded with growing excitement. They could use the dogs as couriers to move supplies and messages and even small weapons if they were smart about concealment. The Krell's own surveillance system had a massive blind spot that could be exploited. Over the next month, the operation expanded significantly as word spread to other survivor groups. The Resistance fitted dogs with specially designed packs that masked their contents from Krell scanners using materials Helen had identified. They established routes through the city based on canine endurance and known patrol patterns, and Marcus became the coordinator of the entire network despite being only 7 years old. He couldn't read complex maps yet, but he understood territory in a way that surprised the adults. He knew which dogs worked best in which areas of the city. He knew when to push operations forward and when to hold back and wait. And most importantly, he knew how to keep the pack safe while maximizing their effectiveness. The Krell remained completely oblivious to what was happening beneath their notice. In their reports back to Commander Vex's command ship, they noted that the conquered population was behaving as expected, which meant hiding and scavenging and slowly starving without organized resistance. They didn't see the network of silent signals passing between a quiet child and a pack of dogs that was spreading hope through the ruins. Dr. Helen Ross had survived the invasion through a combination of luck and stubborn intelligence that refused to accept defeat. When the Krell ships appeared in the sky, she had been in her university lab working on neural interface research. The building took a direct hit during the initial bombardment, but the basement server room where she took shelter had held against the destruction. For 6 weeks, Helen lived in the ruins of the computer science department and rationed food from vending machines while drinking water from a broken pipe. She was slowly starving, but her mind remained sharp and focused on a singular goal. She had been doing something the Krell never anticipated, which was hacking their systems using salvaged alien technology. Helen had doctorates in both computer science and xenolinguistics, which she had earned from a fascination with communicating across species barriers. When pieces of Krell technology started appearing in the rubble from shot-down drones and destroyed vehicles, she collected them obsessively. The Krell might be centuries more advanced, but their coding wasn't magic or incomprehensible. It was mathematics and logic, and patterns could always be broken with enough time and intelligence. Finding, Helen took Marcus and Duke 3 days of careful movement through heavily patrolled territory. The university was deep in Krell-controlled zones with regular patrols and drone surveillance, but the dogs moved through the ruins like ghosts, and Marcus had learned to think like prey and calculate the safest path through danger. When they finally reached the computer science building, Duke alerted to human presence with specific body language. Marcus made the signal for friendly approach and waited patiently while staying hidden. Helen emerged from the shadows, thin and exhausted, with a makeshift weapon in her trembling hands. When she saw a child with a police dog, her first reaction was disbelief and confusion. Then she noticed the professional canine vest on Duke and the organized equipment Marcus carried, and the intelligence in the boy's eyes that seemed far too aware for someone so young. Marcus asked quietly if she was. Dr. Ross and Helen responded with suspicion and caution. Marcus explained that Lisa Martinez had sent him, and that they needed her help understanding Krell technology. He carefully removed the data storage device from his pack and showed it to her. Helen's eyes widened with recognition and hunger for information. She asked where they had gotten such a valuable piece of equipment, and Marcus said he would rather explain somewhere safer than an exposed building. The professor made her decision in seconds because she had been alone too long, hoping for rescue that never came. This child represented something she had stopped believing in, which was organized resistance and hope. She told Marcus to give her 5 minutes to pack her equipment and research notes. Getting Helen back to the tunnels was more complicated because an adult was far more visible than a child or a dog. They had to move slowly and hide frequently and use every trick Marcus had learned over weeks of survival. At one point, a Krell patrol came within meters of their hiding spot in a collapsed storefront. Marcus pressed against Helen in the shadows with one hand on Duke's collar, and the other making the gesture for absolute silence and stillness. Bella, who was scouting ahead, gave the warning signal through body language, and Marcus adjusted their route instantly to avoid the patrol. Helen watched the boy work with growing respect and understanding. This child was conducting a military operation with the precision of a trained officer, and he wasn't just lucky, but genuinely skilled. When they finally reached the resistance base, Helen went immediately to work on the Krell device. Lisa provided her with salvaged computer equipment and power from their improvised generator. For 26 hours straight, Helen worked, sustained only by coffee and determination to crack the alien encryption. Marcus sat nearby with Duke and watched without interfering. He didn't understand the complex coding Helen was doing, but he understood determination and refusing to quit. He had seen it in his mother's eyes when she worked double shifts to keep their apartment. He had seen it in Uncle Paul's face during training exercises. Finally, Helen sat back with a triumphant smile despite her exhaustion. She announced that she was in and had accessed the data successfully. The information was a revelation that changed everything for the resistance. The device contained patrol schedules for the entire Detroit sector and logistics information about supply lines. More valuable was a partial map of the Krell command structure that showed how they were organized and who gave orders to whom. The aliens weren't conquering Earth randomly, but had specific resource extraction targets and processing facilities under construction. They had a timeline for full planetary subjugation that gave humans maybe 3 months before the occupation became permanent and irreversible. Lisa studied the information with intense focus and realized they could predict Krell movements and hit them where they were weak and vulnerable. Helen pulled up another file and explained that she had mapped their communication protocols, and while she couldn't break the encryption, yet she could track the signals and potentially intercept transmissions. Kevin asked about the drones that constantly scanned for human survivors, and Helen smiled with satisfaction. Those were the easiest to understand because their identification system had a massive blind spot built into the programming. They were set to ignore Earth animals entirely because the Krell considered them irrelevant to combat operations. Greggy laughed suddenly with realization and pointed out that the Krell had never encountered a species that trained animals as partners. In their entire empire spanning dozens of conquered worlds, they had never seen cross-species cooperation in warfare. Helen explained that it was more profound than simple ignorance. The Krell were solitary by nature and didn't form emotional bonds even with their own kind. The concept of partnership with another species was literally outside their cultural framework and psychological makeup. They couldn't imagine an animal as an ally or tool. Marcus spoke up quietly with his hand resting on Duke's head. He said simply that the Krell's inability to understand partnership was sad. Everyone turned to look at the boy, and Helen nodded slowly with agreement. It was sad, and it was also their greatest weakness that humans could exploit. Over the following week, Helen integrated her technical expertise with the Resistance's operational capabilities. She modified salvaged radios to track Krell communications even without breaking encryption. She created signal jammers from old electronics that could disrupt alien sensors. Most importantly, she developed a way to mask human heat signatures using thermal blankets and low-power cooling units powered by batteries. The Resistance could now move more freely and strike more effectively and evade detection, with greater success than before. Other survivor groups across the country began reporting similar adaptations as word spread through hidden networks. Humanity was learning and adapting and using every advantage of their home territory against the invaders. But Commander Vex was learning too from his position on the command ship. The attacks were still small and tactically insignificant in the grand scale of planetary conquest. But they were increasing in frequency and sophistication in ways that troubled him. The humans were organizing faster than projections had predicted, while Vex didn't consider them a serious military threat. He recognized the need to accelerate the subjugation timeline before resistance could spread further. The Krell increased their patrols and expanded their processing facilities and began more aggressive roundups of human survivors from the ruins. In the tunnels, Lisa gathered her core team, which included Kevin and Amy and Danny, and Greg and Helen and Marcus with Duke at his side. She stated bluntly that the Krell were escalating operations, and they had maybe a month before the entire region was locked down completely. They needed to do more than harass supply lines and steal data. They needed to hurt the aliens badly enough to slow their timeline and inspire other resistance groups. Amy suggested hitting the main processing facility where the Krell were staging equipment for mining operations. Kevin pointed out that the facility was too well defended and they would never get close enough to cause significant damage. Marcus had been studying the maps Helen had extracted from the data device, and his young mind was processing information in his methodical way. He pointed to a specific location on the display and asked what it was. Helen zoomed in and explained it looked like a communications hub that was relatively small with moderate security. It was probably a relay station for their tactical network across the region. Lisa asked what would happen if they took it out, and Helen explained the Krell would lose coordination across the entire sector temporarily. Their units would still function independently but couldn't communicate with each other or receive orders from the command ship. Greg saw immediately where Marcus's thinking was going and suggested it could serve as a distraction. If they hit the communications hub and created chaos, a second team could strike the processing facility while Krell forces were responding to the first attack. It was ambitious and possibly too ambitious given their limited resources. But they were running out of time and small raids weren't accomplishing enough anymore. The plan developed quickly because the Resistance had already established working systems that could be adapted. The dog network allowed secure coordination across multiple team locations simultaneously. Helen's technical expertise gave them tools to disrupt Krell communications and avoid detection. Marcus's scouting reports provided detailed intelligence on both target locations and the terrain between them. Two teams with one objective, which was to make the Krell pay attention and realize humans were dangerous. Lisa would lead the assault on the communications hub with Kevin and Amy and 8 other fighters. It was the more dangerous mission because it required a direct assault that would draw immediate enemy response. Helen had identified a vulnerability in the hub's defensive systems, which was that the shield generators needed line of sight to maintain coverage. If they could hit from multiple angles simultaneously, they could overwhelm the defenses long enough to plant explosives and withdraw. Greg would lead the second team to the processing facility with Danny and 12 fighters. This was the real target, but it would only work if the Krell diverted forces to defend the communications hub first. Timing was absolutely critical to success. Marcus would coordinate from a central observation position with Duke and Bella and 6 other dogs positioned strategically. The animals would serve as mobile scouts and message relays providing real-time intelligence without any electronic signals the Krell could intercept or trace. The night before the operation, Lisa found Marcus checking equipment with unusual intensity and focus. The boy had been quieter than usual all day, which was significant for a child who rarely spoke anyway. She asked if he was okay, and Marcus continued his work for a moment before answering. He asked what would happen if he messed up and gave the wrong signal, and people died because of his mistake. Lisa knelt beside him and pointed out that Marcus had already saved dozens of lives through his work. The network he helped build and the intelligence he gathered had been invaluable. Marcus said this was different because this was real combat with people counting on him to coordinate perfectly. Lisa reminded him that he was only 7 years old and shouldn't have to carry this weight and responsibility. Marcus looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than 7 and said none of them should have to do any of this. But the aliens didn't ask what anyone wanted when they invaded. There was no good response to that simple truth, so Lisa simply squeezed his shoulder and moved on to final preparations. The operation launched at 2 in the morning when Krell patrols were at minimum staffing levels. Lisa's team moved into position around the communications hub using routes Marcus had carefully mapped over weeks of observation. The dogs spread out across the operational area and positioned themselves on rooftops and in ruins, where they could observe all target zones and approach paths. Marcus sat in an abandoned office building 4 blocks from the hub surrounded by maps and observation notes. Duke lay beside him, calm and ready for action. Through night vision binoculars salvaged from a police station, Marcus could see Bella on a rooftop to the north and Shadow positioned to the east and Ace watching the western approach. At precisely 2:30, Marcus gave the signal by standing clearly visible in the window to the positioned dogs. He made the specific gesture Uncle Paul had taught him, which meant execute the plan now. The dogs relayed the command through a cascade of positions, with each animal responding to the visual cue from the previous one in the chain. Within 90 seconds, every team member had received the go order without a single electronic transmission that Krell sensors could detect. Lisa's team struck first with improvised explosives detonating at 3 points around the communications hub simultaneously. The Krell shields flickered from the coordinated impact, and in that moment of vulnerability, the fighters poured fire into the building's exterior systems. They weren't using weak human weapons, but captured Krell rifles scavenged from disabled drones and fallen soldiers. Helen had taught them to operate the alien weapons, and now that knowledge paid off. The Krell response was immediate and overwhelming, just as planned. Soldiers poured from nearby facilities and drones launched into the air with weapons hot. Commander Vex monitored the situation from his command ship and was annoyed that primitive humans had managed to locate and strike a communications node. He ordered 3 full squads to secure the hub and eliminate the attackers, which was exactly what Lisa had anticipated and wanted. 12 blocks away, Greg's team moved on the processing facility while Krell forces diverted to respond to the communications hub attack. With security at minimum staffing, the facility's defenses were vulnerable. Helen had provided them with a virus she developed from captured technology, which was simple but effective code that would corrupt the facility's operating system. They didn't need to destroy the building physically, but just needed to shut it down and delay operations. Greg's team breached the perimeter and planted Helen's virus in the main computer systems and grabbed samples of Krell technology for later study. Marcus watched it all unfold from his observation position with Duke pressed against his leg for comfort and reassurance. He saw Krell forces mobilizing toward Lisa's position, and he saw Greg's team breach the facility successfully. Then he saw something that changed the plan, which was a Krell patrol heading directly toward Greg's extraction route. Without hesitation, Marcus signaled Bella. and the dog immediately moved to a new position where Greg's team could see her clearly. When Greg glanced up during the extraction, he saw Bella's alert posture and recognized the warning. Enemy approaching. From the south, which meant their planned route was compromised. Greg made a split-second decision and altered their extraction path. His team withdrew through a different route that avoided the patrol Marcus had spotted through the dog network. They made it out without contact or casualties. Lisa's team had a harder extraction because they had completed their objective of crippling the communications hub, but the Krell had them pinned down. Amy took a plasma burn to her shoulder and Kevin's position was getting hammered by drone fire. Marcus saw what was happening and made another critical decision. He signaled Shadow, who was positioned near a cache of flashbang grenades the Resistance had prepared as backup. The dog retrieved the devices following Marcus's hand signals and dropped them at specific points that created a pattern of diversions. The Krell, confused by explosions coming from unexpected directions, split their forces to investigate multiple threats. In that moment of confusion and divided attention, Lisa's team broke contact and disappeared into the ruins using routes Marcus directed through the dogs. Marcus didn't stop coordinating until every Resistance fighter and every dog had returned to safe positions. Only then did he allow himself to shake with delayed fear and stress from the intense operation. The operation was a complete success by every measure. The communications hub was destroyed and would take days to rebuild. The processing facility was offline with corrupted systems that would delay resource extraction. The Krell had suffered their first significant setback since the invasion began. More importantly, word spread among surviving human populations throughout the region and beyond. The aliens could be hurt and outsmarted and beaten despite their superior technology. Hope, which was humanity's most dangerous trait, began to spread like wildfire through the ruins. Commander Vex reviewed damage reports with barely contained fury that was unusual for normally calm Krell leaders. The attacks had been coordinated, with sophistication that shouldn't be possible for this primitive species. Worse, his technical staff reported that the processing facility's systems had been compromised by a virus showing understanding of Krell programming architecture. The humans were learning at an accelerating rate and adapting to occupation faster than any species the Krell had previously conquered. They had progressed from simple survival to organized resistance to actual military effectiveness in less than 2 months. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Vex felt something the Krell Empire hadn't experienced in its last 100 conquests, which was genuine concern about outcome. He issued new orders to increase planetary security protocols and accelerate resource extraction before natives could organize further. Most importantly, he ordered his forces to locate and eliminate the leadership of this resistance movement immediately. The Krell began hunting for the humans directing these operations, but they made one critical assumption that would prove fatal to their plans. They believed resistance was led by experienced military officers or government officials who had survived the initial invasion. They were searching for adult authority figures and trained soldiers and strategic military minds. They never considered that their most dangerous enemy coordinating strikes against them might be a 7-year-old boy who spoke in whispers and gave orders with hand signals to a pack of dogs who trusted him completely. Commander Vex personally oversaw interrogations of captured human survivors in an attempt to identify resistance leadership and break their organization. The Krell employed advanced neural scanners that could extract information directly from organic minds without physical torture. Most humans broke immediately under this technology and provided locations of safe houses and names of resistance members and operational details they knew, but the information was always outdated and incomplete by the time Krell forces acted on it. By the time they raided locations, the resistance had already moved and left only empty buildings and cold trails behind. The humans were moving faster than the Krell could track them, as if they had advance warning of every operation planned against them. They did have advance warning through Helen's work. She had cracked enough of the Krell communication protocols to detect when the aliens were planning raids against resistance positions. She couldn't read full transmissions yet, but she could identify operational keywords and target coordinates in the signal patterns, combined with the dog network for rapid undetectable communication. The Resistance stayed one step ahead. Constantly, Marcus had proven so effective at coordination that the Resistance expanded his role significantly. Now he worked with Helen in the technical operations center they had established in a deep sub-basement. While Helen monitored Krell communications, Marcus watched the dogs positioned throughout the city and interpreted their signals and updated tactical maps in real time. He had also started teaching other children his system of working with the dogs. The resistance had rescued 37 kids from the ruins who were orphans or separated from parents. While adults wanted to keep them safe and hidden, Marcus argued that children could move through the city even more easily than dogs because the Krell literally didn't see them as threats worth monitoring. One evening, Lisa watched Marcus teaching a 10-year-old girl named Sophie how to read Duke's body language and signals. The girl was attentive but scared, and still traumatized from watching her family captured during a Krell roundup operation. Marcus asked patiently, "When Duke's ears go forward and his tail drops low, what does that signal mean to a handler?" Sophie answered that it meant alert, because something is wrong but not immediate danger requiring action. Marcus nodded approval and asked what it meant if Duke showed his teeth but didn't growl or bark. Sophie said it meant aggressive threat nearby and humans should hide immediately and stay silent. Marcus told her. She was learning fast and tomorrow they would practice. With Bella, who was pickier about who she trusted, Sophie would need to approach the dog differently and earn her confidence. After the lesson, Lisa pulled Marcus aside and told him he was surprisingly good with the other kids and very patient. Marcus shrugged and explained his mom was a teacher before the invasion. She always said everyone learns differently and you just have to figure out how each person's mind works. Lisa asked carefully if Marcus thought his mother was still alive somewhere. The boy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. He said he didn't know for sure, but if she was alive, he needed to make sure there was still a world worth living in when he found her again. The Krell's search for resistance leadership was intensifying, with increased patrols and more aggressive interrogations. Vex had brought in a specialist from the Empire's core worlds named Interrogator Call, whose expertise was breaking insurgencies on conquered planets. Call reviewed all available intelligence and reached a disturbing conclusion that troubled him. He explained to Vex that the coordination pattern was wrong and didn't match normal resistance cell behavior. The humans were responding to Krell movements before operations were completed. They were reading Krell intentions and not just reacting to actions after the fact. Vex asked skeptically if Call thought humans had infiltrated their communication systems somehow. Call said no because their encryption remained unbroken and secure. But the humans were detecting their signals somehow and recognizing patterns in transmission activity. More disturbing was the movement pattern of how resistance cells coordinated without any detectable electronic communication between them. In 40 years of counterinsurgency work across a dozen worlds, Call had never seen anything like this communication method. Vex asked what Call recommended as a strategy to break the resistance. Call explained they needed to change tactics completely and stop trying to track human communications because they weren't using methods the Krell could intercept. Instead, they should track human movements and set traps and force the resistance to respond in predictable ways. Call's strategy was implemented immediately across all Krell operations. They began staging fake operations that appeared important, but were actually designed to lure resistance forces into ambushes. They varied patrol patterns specifically to disrupt the observational intelligence humans were gathering. Most significantly, they started paying attention to things previously ignored, which included animals and children and anything that might be serving as eyes and ears for resistance. Networks. Marcus noticed the change within 3 days of implementation. The Krell patrols were moving unpredictably now, and doubling back on routes and checking areas they had previously cleared and dismissed. Worse, the drones that had always ignored dogs were starting to track them more carefully with active scanning. Marcus reported to the Leadership Council that the Krell were adapting to resistance tactics. They knew humans were watching them, but they didn't know how the observation network functioned yet. Greg asked if they could adjust their methods to stay ahead. Marcus studied his maps with furrowed concentration and said maybe, but they needed to be more careful now. The dogs couldn't be as obvious about scouting, and they needed to change their operational patterns. Helen spoke up and agreed that Marcus was correct in his assessment. They had been reactive and waiting for the Krell to make moves and then countering those moves. Now they needed to become proactive and force the Krell to respond to human actions instead. Kevin asked with frustration what resources they had for proactive operations when they We're barely keeping ahead of Krell forces now. Marcus looked up from his maps and everyone fell silent at the intensity in his young face. He said they should use what the Krell didn't understand about humanity. The aliens were looking for adult leaders and military structures and traditional resistance organization. They were looking for electronic communications and conventional tactics. Marcus explained they should do the opposite of what the Krell expected. Use children as scouts because aliens ignored them completely. Use dogs not just for communication, but as active participants in operations. Strike at targets the Krell thought were too unimportant to defend heavily. Lisa asked what kind of targets Marcus meant specifically. The boy pointed to several locations on the map that Helen had identified from captured data. These were supply depots and vehicle maintenance, facilities and small outposts that supported larger Krell operations. Marcus explained that the Krell protected their important facilities heavily, but these support locations had minimal security. If resistance hit multiple support targets simultaneously, the aliens would have to spread their forces thin to protect everything. Amy understood the strategy immediately and pointed out it was classic guerrilla warfare adapted for their specific situation. Make the enemy defend everything, which meant they defended nothing effectively. Over the next week, the resistance reorganized completely based on Marcus's insights. They created small independent cells that could operate without central coordination. They trained more children to work with dogs as scout teams. They identified dozens of minor Krell targets that individually weren't important but collectively supported the entire occupation infrastructure. Sophie became one of Marcus's best students and learned to work with Bella despite the dog's initial wariness. Other children adapted quickly to the system because they were naturally observant and the dogs seemed to trust them. Instinctively, the new strategy launched with coordinated strikes across the entire Detroit sector. 12 resistance cells hit 12 different targets simultaneously and withdrew before Krell forces could respond effectively. None of the targets were critical, but all of them disrupted operations and forced the aliens to divert resources to security. Commander Vex watched reports flood in from across his occupation zone and felt something the Krell rarely experienced, which was frustration bordering on anger. The humans weren't fighting like a conventional resistance anymore. They were everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, like an infection spreading through his operational structure. Kahl reviewed the new pattern of attacks and made a troubling observation. The coordination was too precise for independent cells operating randomly. Someone or something was directing overall strategy, even if individual operations were decentralized. More disturbing was evidence that humans were using animals and children as part of their intelligence network. Krell soldiers reported seeing dogs and young humans in areas shortly before attacks occurred, but they hadn't connected these observations to resistance activity until analyzing patterns afterward. Vex made a decision that would change the nature of the occupation. If animals and children were part of the resistance network, then they would no longer be ignored. The evacuation of children and dogs from Detroit took 5 days of careful planning and execution. The resistance used every trick they had learned about moving through Krell-controlled territory without detection. Small groups traveled at night using routes Marcus had mapped over months of observation. Each group had adult escorts and emergency protocols if they encountered enemy patrols. Marcus insisted on staying in the city despite Lisa's arguments that he should evacuate with the other children. He pointed out that he was the only one who understood the complete network and how all the pieces fit together. Without him, coordinating the resistance would lose its most effective advantage over the Krell. Lisa finally agreed, but only if Marcus stayed in the deepest and most secure location they had, which was a bunker 3 levels below the subway tunnels. Duke remained with him as always, and Helen set up her technical equipment in the same location so they could work together. The Krell noticed the sudden absence of dogs and children in the occupied zones, and Interrogator Kahl reported to Vex that it appeared the resistance had withdrawn their intelligence network. Captured humans under interrogation confirmed. The children had been evacuated but couldn't or wouldn't say where. Vex considered this a significant victory because it meant the humans had lost their primary advantage. He ordered his forces to accelerate resource extraction operations while the resistance was disorganized. Processing facilities that had been damaged were repaired and brought back online. Supply convoys moved with lighter security because the threat seemed diminished. It was exactly what Marcus had predicted and planned for. For 2 weeks, the resistance appeared to collapse with no coordinated attacks and no disruption of Krell operations. Patrols reported empty streets and abandoned safe houses and signs that humans were giving up and accepting occupation. Then everything changed in a single coordinated strike that stunned the Krell completely. On the 15th day of apparent inactivity, resistance cells hit 18 critical targets simultaneously across 3 cities. These weren't minor support facilities, but major command posts and resource processing centers and communication hubs that controlled entire regional operations. The attacks were devastating because the Krell had reduced security based on the belief that resistance was broken. Facilities that should have been impregnable were breached by small teams using tactics the aliens had never encountered before. Explosives were planted in critical systems and viruses were introduced into computer networks, and entire operations were shut down in minutes. Commander Vex stared at damage reports in disbelief and rage. How had the humans coordinated such a massive operation without any detectable communications? How had they known exactly where to strike for maximum impact? And how had they moved through occupied territory without his forces seeing them coming? Call analyzed the attack patterns and reached a conclusion that challenged everything the Krell understood about human capabilities. The resistance hadn't lost their intelligence network at all, but had hidden it and allowed the Krell to think they were winning. Then they had struck when Krell defenses were weakest with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of enemy dispositions. In the deep bunker, Marcus stood before a wall covered in maps and notes and observation data. He had spent 2 weeks analyzing every piece of information Helen extracted from Krell communications. He had identified patterns in how the aliens responded to threats, and where they concentrated forces, and what they considered strategically important. The coordinated strikes had been designed to cripple Krell operations across the entire regional command structure simultaneously. But more importantly, they were designed to force a specific response that Marcus was counting on. Vex did exactly what Marcus predicted and recalled: forces from outlying areas to defend critical facilities in major cities. This meant rural areas and suburban zones suddenly had minimal Krell presence. And that was where the evacuated children and dogs had been hiding with resistance cells that were preparing for the next phase. Lisa led a massive operation to rescue human prisoners from labor camps that had been established in rural areas. With Krell forces recalled to defend cities, the camps were lightly guarded and vulnerable. Resistance teams moved in simultaneously and freed over 3,000 people who had been rounded up for processing. The freed prisoners were evacuated to hidden locations in forested areas and mountains, where Krell technology was less effective. Communities began forming in these safe zones with food production and medical care and defensive preparations. Humanity was no longer just surviving but beginning to rebuild while still fighting. Marcus coordinated everything from his bunker using a network that had evolved beyond just dogs and children. Now they had human scouts spread across hundreds of miles and relay stations that passed information through chains of observers. The Krell couldn't intercept communications that didn't use electronics and couldn't track movements they couldn't detect. Helen made a breakthrough that changed the strategic situation completely. She had been working for months on Krell encryption and finally cracked the core algorithms. Now she could read their communications in real time and access their tactical networks and even monitor conversations between Vex and his command staff. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The Krell Empire was having second thoughts about Earth because the conquest was taking too long and costing too many resources. Other Empire priorities were demanding attention, and Vex was under pressure to either complete subjugation quickly or abandon the operation entirely. But abandoning meant admitting failure, which was unacceptable to Krell, pride in military doctrine. So Vex was planning a final massive operation to break human resistance permanently. He was bringing in reinforcements from other conquered worlds and preparing to implement scorched earth tactics that would destroy human population centers completely. Lisa called an emergency meeting of all resistance leadership, and they gathered in person for the first time in months. The group had grown to include representatives from 12 different cities and rural communities. Marcus attended despite being the youngest person in the room by decades. They reviewed Helen's intelligence about the coming Krell offensive and debated their options. Some argued they should evacuate everyone to the safe zones and abandon the cities completely. Others wanted to fight and make the Krell pay for every meter of ground. Marcus listened to the arguments and thought about everything he had learned over 6 months of fighting. He thought about his mother, who he still hoped was alive somewhere. He thought about Uncle Paul, who had taught him about dogs and duty. He thought about Duke sleeping at his feet and all the other dogs and children who had become his family. Finally, he spoke up in his quiet voice and everyone stopped to listen because they had learned that when Marcus spoke it was worth hearing. He said they were thinking about the problem wrong because they were focused on fighting the Krell when they should be thinking about making the Krell leave. Greg asked what difference that made, because either way they had to defeat the enemy. Marcus shook his head and explained that defeating the Krell militarily was impossible because the aliens had superior technology and reinforcements. But making them leave was possible because Helen's intelligence showed they were already questioning whether Earth was worth the cost. Amy understood where he was going and asked how they could increase the cost to make the Krell give up. Marcus pulled out maps showing Krell resource extraction operations and supply lines and command infrastructure. He explained they had been hitting military targets, but the real objective should be making occupation economically impossible. If they destroyed extraction equipment and contaminated resource stockpiles and disrupted supply lines, constantly the Krell would be spending more resources than they gained from Earth. Eventually, the Empire would calculate that Earth was a losing investment and withdraw to focus on more profitable conquests. Kevin pointed out that would require sustained operations over months or years while avoiding complete annihilation. Marcus agreed and said that was why they needed to shift from resistance fighting to long-term guerrilla warfare designed for economic disruption rather than military victory. Helen added that she could help by feeding false intelligence into Krell systems to make them believe resistance was even larger and more organized than reality. The aliens would overestimate the threat and allocate excessive resources to security instead of extraction. Lisa made the decision that would define humanity's strategy for the rest of the war. They would implement Marcus's plan and transform from a resistance movement into a persistent insurgency designed to make Earth economically worthless to the Krell Empire. They would make the aliens regret ever coming to humanity's world. Over the next month, the entire resistance reorganized around economic disruption rather than military confrontation. They developed new tactics focused on sabotaging extraction equipment and contaminating resource stockpiles and destroying supply infrastructure. Every operation was designed to cost the Krell more than it gained them. Marcus coordinated it all with help from Helen and the dog network that had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Now they had communication. 8 months after the invasion began, the Krell Empire's High Command made an unprecedented decision. They authorized Commander Vex to implement full planetary subjugation protocols, which meant destroying any infrastructure or population that resisted. It was a scorched earth policy that the Empire rarely used because it reduced the value of conquered worlds. But Earth had become a black hole consuming resources and producing nothing. The High Command decided that either the planet would be brought to heel completely, or it would be reduced to worthless rubble as an example to other species. Vex had 60 days to break human resistance, or he would be replaced by someone who would burn the planet. Helen detected the change in Krell communication patterns immediately and decrypted the orders Vex had received. She brought the information to Marcus and Lisa and the Leadership Council with grim determination. The Krell were preparing to escalate beyond anything they had faced before. Vex was bringing in 4 additional warships and ground forces that would triple Krell military presence on Earth. They were positioning orbital weapons capable of destroying entire cities, and they were implementing new protocols to systematically eliminate all human population centers, larger than small villages. Lisa looked at the intelligence and felt despair creeping in despite months of successful resistance. They had hurt the Krell and slowed them down and saved thousands of people. But facing complete annihilation from orbital weapons was beyond anything resistance forces could counter. Marcus sat quietly with Duke and studied the information without showing emotion. He had grown thinner over the months, and there were dark circles under his young eyes from too little sleep. But his mind remained sharp and his determination never wavered. He asked Helen if the Krell could detect when humans were accessing their communication systems. Helen explained she had masked her access carefully, but eventually Krell security would notice the intrusion. Marcus nodded and said then they should use that as an advantage before it became a weakness. Lisa asked what he meant, and Marcus explained his idea. If Helen could make it obvious that humans were inside Krell systems, what would the aliens do? Amy immediately understood and said they would shut down their networks completely to prevent further infiltration and switched to secure hardline communications only. Marcus agreed and said that would blind the Krell to their own forces spread across the planet. Individual units would still function, but coordinating between them would become difficult. Then he asked what would happen if resistance forces launched simultaneous attacks across every Krell position on Earth at the exact moment their communications went dark. Kevin whistled softly and said it would create chaos because Krell commanders couldn't coordinate response or call for reinforcements. Each position would think they were facing the main attack and respond independently. Greg pointed out they didn't have enough fighters to actually attack everywhere simultaneously. Marcus smiled slightly, which was rare for him, and said they didn't need to actually attack everywhere, but just needed the Krell to think they were under attack everywhere. Helen understood immediately what Marcus was proposing. They would use her access to Krell systems to plant false reports of attacks across hundreds of locations. Then they would shut down the networks before the Krell could verify which reports were real. Krell forces would respond to phantom threats and spread themselves thin, while real resistance operations hit critical targets. But there was more to Marcus's plan. While the Krell were distracted by false attacks and communication blackouts, the resistance would implement a massive evacuation of civilians from all major cities. They would move hundreds of thousands of people to safe zones before the orbital weapons could be deployed, and they would document everything using salvage cameras and broadcasting it to the world. Lisa asked how broadcasting would help if Earth's communication systems were controlled by the Krell. Marcus explained that Helen had found something in the Krell databases, which was the location of an old human satellite network that the aliens had ignored because it seemed obsolete and non-threatening. Helen added that she could reactivate some satellites and broadcast messages to other resistance groups worldwide. More importantly, she could broadcast to the galaxy because Krell communication networks extended across their empire. If she hijacked their network, humanity could tell their story to every conquered species in Krell space. Danny pointed out that exposing Krell brutality wouldn't stop them from destroying Earth. Marcus agreed, but said it might inspire other conquered species to resist. If the Krell had to face multiple insurgencies across their empire, they would have to abandon some conquests to maintain control of others. Earth might still be destroyed, but humanity would take the Krell Empire down with them. It was a desperate plan with minimal chance of success, but it was better than waiting to be annihilated without fighting back. The Leadership Council voted unanimously to implement Marcus's strategy, and preparations began immediately. Over the next 3 weeks, the Resistance prepared for the largest coordinated operation in human history. Every resistance cell across every continent received instructions through the silent signal network. Children and dogs carried messages to remote locations where electronic communication was impossible. Communities in safe zones prepared to receive massive refugee populations. Marcus worked constantly with almost no sleep, coordinating thousands of moving pieces. Helen programmed the false attack reports and prepared to hijack Krell communications. Lisa organized the military strikes that would hit real targets while the aliens were distracted. And Duke never left Marcus's side, providing silent comfort and partnership through it all. The night before the operation, Marcus sat alone with Duke in the bunker and allowed himself to think about his mother for the first time in weeks. He still didn't know if she was alive, but he had to believe she was somewhere. He had to believe he would find her when this was over. That belief was what kept him going when everything seemed hopeless. Duke put his head in Marcus's lap and the boy hugged the dog tightly. He whispered that he was scared and Duke licked his face because that was what dogs did when their humans needed comfort. Marcus smiled and said they would get through this together, like they had gotten through everything else. The operation launched at dawn when Krell patrols were changing shifts and communication traffic was heaviest. Helen activated her programs and false reports of attacks flooded Krell systems from thousands of locations. At the same moment, she shut down their communication networks completely and rerouted some channels to broadcast capability. Commander Vex watched his tactical displays go dark and felt panic for the first time in his military career. Reports were coming in from everywhere indicating coordinated human attacks across the entire planet. He couldn't verify which reports were real or coordinate responses between his scattered forces. His entire command structure collapsed into chaos within minutes. Then his communication officer reported something impossible. Their broadcast network had been hijacked, and was transmitting on frequencies that reached across the Empire. Someone was using Krell technology to send messages to the galaxy. The message was simple and devastating. A young human voice spoke clearly in standard Krell military language, which Helen had taught Marcus to pronounce correctly. The voice explained that Earth was under illegal occupation by Krell forces, and that humanity was resisting with all available means. The message included video documentation of Krell war crimes and civilian casualties in destroyed cities. But the most powerful part of the message was the image of a small boy standing with a dog beside him, and other children visible in the background. Marcus looked directly into the camera and spoke words that would echo across the galaxy for generations. He said the Krell believed they were conquering primitives who would submit to superior force. But they were wrong, because humanity would never submit and never surrender, no matter the cost. He said other species conquered by the Krell should know they were not alone, because Earth stood with them in resistance. And he said the occupation of Earth would fail because the Krell had forgotten one crucial truth, which was that the strongest bonds couldn't be broken by force. Marcus put his hand on Duke's head and said humans had learned to build partnerships across species, and that bond made them stronger than any empire built on conquest. He said the Krell could destroy Earth, but they couldn't destroy the idea that friendship and loyalty were more powerful than weapons and domination. The broadcast reached every corner of Krell space before they could shut it down. Conquered species across dozens of worlds heard humanity's message of defiance and hope, and something remarkable began to happen. Other insurgencies began to flare up on other conquered worlds inspired by Earth's example. Species that had accepted occupation for decades suddenly remembered they could resist. On Earth, the evacuation proceeded with remarkable success, while Krell forces were paralyzed by communication failures and false reports. Millions of humans moved from cities to safe zones using routes the resistance had prepared. The Krell launched orbital strikes on empty cities, thinking they were destroying population centers but hitting only buildings.